Okay, hi again. Sorry for unloading on you today. There's a lot to pay attention to, and I know you might be a little overwhelmed and confused, so hope you're holding. So I'm finally posting a few notes, some slides, and some comments about Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, which you've already been reading, and we just haven't had a chance to actually begin discussing, so we're a little behind. So you can find the link to these slides now in the Corona syllabus under the schedule for today. So I'm trying to sort of keep that as a central hub, and you can follow along or come back to them or whatever, but of course you can also just follow on my screen. So Metamorphosis was published in 1915. So Af Franz Kafka lived between 1883 and 1924. So it was published in the middle of World War One. His writing is generally known to have isolated protagonists facing bizarre or surrealistic predicaments and incomprehensible socio-bureaucratic powers. So if you ever hear someone say like, "Oh, this feels very Kafkaesque," what they mean is it's a very distinctive style that he was writing in. And it generally means that there are forms or administrations or bureaucracies that are blocking someone from fully exercising what it means to being human. So if you've ever dealt with HR or with CUNY first, or any of the bureaucratic structures behind CUNY, you kind of know what we're talking about here. And right now, even this week, we've been experiencing a little bit of a Kafkaesque nightmare because forces beyond our control that we just kind of have to adapt to. So a lot of his work deals with these kinds of situations. Um, he lived from 1883 to 1924 and died pretty young at age 40 from tuberculosis. He was born into a middle-class Jewish family in what is now the Czech Republic. So I've given you a little map here of this landlocked country. He was trained as a lawyer, but he ended up working for an insurance company. So you might already be able to make some connections then in terms of him kind of just being like a white collar worker and having to serve other people and manage other people's sort of finances in terms of Gregor's predicament in Metamorphosis. Very few, Kafka is famous now. He was not famous during his life. Very few of his works were actually published during his lifetime, so he really didn't want to be famous. He had actually requested that his friend burn some of his unfinished works after he died, but his friend went against his wishes. So, yeah, he did not become rich and famous during his life as a writer. He was known to have some anarchist and socialist leanings. I can't actually read this underneath my own. Oh, okay, put me up there. So one key theory here that might be important for you all to think about is, and that he was interested in, is Karl Marx's theory of alienation. So the idea of being estranged from aspects of your environment and or your species essence as a consequence of living in a society of stratified social classes. So that's a tough concept, and you can look it up more if you're interested in Marx or social theory like that. But you know, the idea that modern industrialization and capitalism is actually drawing us further away both from each other and from who we are meant to be as humans in terms of our own emotional connection. So you can think about how that plays into metamorphosis. Something that is very relevant for our text, especially if you've been reading ahead a little bit, is Kafka's own estranged relationship with his father. So you can follow this link for the full article from a really great website called Brain Pickings, where I got much of this information. And I think this is something that a lot of us, unfortunately, today can still relate to very strongly in terms of our own relationships with our parents. um, so he considered his father to be intellectually dominating, emotionally abusive. He didn't really physically abuse him, except as back in the day, they did kind of undergo capital punishment, and that was still okay. But um, it was more the emotional and the psychological abuse that really affected Franz's whole life. He felt constant disappointment and he felt that he was constantly disappointing his father. And if he was ever excited about something as a kid, we're talking basically about childhood trauma and the effects that has in those formative years on the rest of your life. So if you're interested in psychology or childhood development, this might be sort of particularly interesting for you. So anything that caused Franz joy, the father would just kind of shut down and not participate in his happiness. There was a sense his father considered himself to have pulled himself out of poverty, kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps type mentality. And because of that, he was very cruel and harsh and demanding on his family members and people around him. So Kafka felt like he was constantly, underperforming and disappointing his father and could never live up to his father's impossibly high standards. Very much an authoritarian and kind of tyrannical figure in his household. And we see that again later playing out with Gregor in Metamorphosis in terms of his father's relationship. And I think this domestic sphere, so what happens within the home, becomes a kind of metaphor for the rest of society. So it's not just about the family, but it's about patriarchy more generally. Um, he had the sense that everything he did was wrong as a kid, which, has long-term emotional and psychological impacts. And I've just given you some excerpts from that article that I thought were particularly poignant. You can pause the video if you want and read on your own. I think this one over here. Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you. As usual, I was unable to think of any answer to your question, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, and partly because an explanation of the grounds for this fear would mean going into far more details that I could even approximately keep in mind while talking. And if now I try to give you an answer in writing, it will still be very incomplete, because even in writing, this fear and its consequences hamper me in relation to you, and because the magnitude of the subject goes far beyond the scope of my memory and power of reasoning. So you can see just like a lot of emotional blockage there in terms of even trying to communicate with his father to be able to open up. And this is a letter. Sorry, I should have mentioned. All of this is taken from an actual letter that he wrote to his father. That was a very long letter that's sort of trying to repair things that was actually never delivered while Kafka was in his 30s. And he describes over here an interesting and traumatic incident that might connect with our tale as well, where as a young boy, he really needed water, maybe just because he was being annoying, not because he needed or was terribly thirsty. But then his dad became so angry that he yanked Franz out of bed, carried him onto the balcony, and left him there, but in nothing but his nightshirt, shutting the door. So you can see that kind of entrapment, which he describes caused him inner harm. Was for me a matter of course, that senseless asking for water and the extraordinary terror of being carried outside were two things that I could never properly connect with one another. Even years after, as I suffered from the tormenting fantasy that the huge man, my father, the ultimate authority, would come almost for no reason at all and take me out of bed in the night and carry me out onto the balcony. And that meant I was a mere nothing for him. So you can start to think about how deeply even this one incident impacted him. More excerpts. I'm really interested in this. This is an illustration from a children's book of Metamorphosis. he talks about, yeah, I won't read this, except that just his own all-consuming self-doubt and sense of being unsure of his own body. So if we want to think about Gregor in our tale as some kind of protagonist that relates to Franz Kafka himself, that I think we can find this here, that he started to become certain of his even his humanity in his own body and his ability to control it and be in possession of himself. I think this is just a very nice, beautiful comment as well. It is, after all, not necessarily to fly right into the middle of the sun, but it is necessary to crawl to a clean little spot on earth where the sun sometimes shines and one can warm himself a little. So he couldn't even find, spots to warm himself in the context of his relationship with his father. So you can read more if you're interested in this pre-archiving paper or whatever if you follow this link. Okay, we're at 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to talk about Metamorphosis now in under 5 minutes because that's, 4 minutes, because that's all we have. Turns out lecturing takes a lot of time. So it's interesting, he said his father was very opposed to his proposed marriage, by the way, and that was what caused a lot of strife between him. His father hated his fiance. He wrote to his fiance one day that he was working on a story that came to me in my misery lying in bed and was now haunting him. So I think that connection with his fears and anxieties and just how you feel when you lie in bed sometimes is kind of interesting. Here's some key terms that you can write down. Of course, metamorphosis means something you need to know, means change, transformation. And so you can think about what is transforming into what here. And it's also a potential reference to Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is from Greek mythology, deals with the gods and their relations with humans. Kafkaesque, which I've already introduced to you as a term, tragic comedy, which is kind of what this is. It's sort of black humor. It's got some tragic elements, but it's got some really comedic elements as well. So it's both tragedy and comedy. That's all that term means. Gregor might be considered an anti-hero. He's not exactly a wonderful person or bug or insect or whatever it is. But yet he's a protagonist, so we're supposed to sort of be on his side, even if we don't agree with everything. So this is a symbol of something else, and precarity, alienation. I've already talked about alienation a little bit, and precarity is just the sense of at any moment something can change and how we lack stability as a society. This phrase, this refers to, I cannot say this, I don't speak German, this is translated from the German. This is the actual creature that he is, and so that's what this next slide is all about, and this is a little more important in terms of Ungeheres Ungezeifer. Don't laugh at me. In our edition, it says, as Gregor Samsa woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed into a monstrous insect. Well, that's one way to translate it. A more literal translation might be monstrous vermin, or literally, monstrous or unclean animal unfit for sacrifice. So he's not exactly a bug. He's not exactly an insect. Sometimes it's translated as a rodent, some kind, or a vermin, some kind of rat-like creature. So you want to think about, who are you picturing here? What kind of monster, and what do the different shapes signify, or how does that change the way you perceive the poem or the story? An absolutely literal translation might be, as Gregor Samsa one morning from uneasy dreams awoke, which is sort of, by the way, how Kafka conceived of the story, is these uneasy dreams. He found himself in his bed into a gigantic insect-like creature transformed. So the last word is actually transformed, which is sort of interesting. But this writer, Vladimir Nabokov, actually thought that Gregor was a beetle with wings under his shell and capable of flight. So I guess maybe we'll talk about this first edition when we meet on Zoom, because I can't talk about everything. This is crazy. We'll pick up on this and think about what you think the metaphorical meaning is. So we've just talked a lot about the literal meaning. What about the metaphor? What is this whole little allegory meant to signify? And so I've given you some assignments in these last couple slides, and then we're going to be cut off here. So we will pick up on this on Zoom. Thank you for listening.